The IMF updates the world to say Bitcoin is like digital gold. Now, did this actually happen? Kind of. It's not as straightforward as saying, hey, Bitcoin, we're now going to recognize it as digital gold. But first of all, what is the IMF? Well, if you imagine the banking system, so you have the commercial banks that you and I may use for mortgages, current accounts, that kind of stuff. They're at the sort of bottom. Then you have the central banks. The central banks are in charge of all those local banks within that country. So the central bank is in charge of all the banks in that country. The IMF, so remember, every country around the world has a central bank. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is sort of in charge of all of those banks. It's not directly, it can't just walk up to them and say, do what we tell you. But it seems like an industry standard. They push out regulations, ideas, suggestions that other banks should follow. And they do tend to follow them. Now, where they get a lot of their power from is if they go to a developing nation and that country wants to borrow some money to expand its economy or something like that, it'll say, can I borrow $100 billion? The IMF will give them that money, but will say to them, yes, however, you have to adopt all of these standards. So it puts them in debt to the IMF, and they tell them what to do in that way. So they do have a lot of power, the IMF, but the main thing they do is they write reports and send them out to all the central banks as recommendations. Within that is what's been said here. So it's the IMF updates global standards to include Bitcoin. But actually what happened is they put it together in a report, and they actually categorized, well, what they said is new digital assets designed to be used as a means of payment or act as a store of value. So it's not directly saying Bitcoin is digital gold, but it is sending this information out there to other banks to say, hey, it's time to wake up. These assets are here. It's start to, need to consider them. But the big point here is banks are now able to custody cryptocurrency. So you can see how this is all starting to change. But why is this good for crypto? Well, these guys who are in charge of the global banking system, in a way, are waking up to digital assets. They're realizing that they are not going anywhere. There was a long period of time where banks would say, hey, you can't have crypto, we're totally against it. But now the guys who are in charge of all the banks are starting to wake up to this. So it makes it more likely that banks are going to start becoming friendlier to cryptocurrency. But if you remember this, that Bitcoin and crypto are limited in supply. So if banks start to wake up to this and recognize this and think, hey, we can comfortably custody these assets, it's going to take more from the circulating supply, making it more and more scarce. So this is massive. This is massive for crypto, and regulations are starting to change.